My name is Diana Scrizlow, and this is Dina Dawoud, and we are from the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science. And today we're going to share with you how we use collaborative in-class assignments in our large introductory courses. This is based a little bit on previous work that I did where I used collaborative in-class assignments in a small class, which was funded by a Light grant, and we thought maybe it would work in large classes as well. So to start off, we first use these collaborative in-class assignments in small or medium-sized classes, as I mentioned. Stat 334 is a third-year course for financial math students, and AXI 232 is a second-year course for actuarial science students. And these courses are required, but they're not actually very large. How we used them was they were regular every week, and they were worth 1% each of the course. So they were a fairly small, low stakes assessment, but they were regular throughout the term. And the students completed their problems in pre-assigned groups. And those groups rotated from week to week. So students were not always working with the same people. They were sometimes working with different folks, so they would get a chance to meet lots of their classmates throughout the term. During the tutorial, they would be given some problems to work on, and they were allowed to consult their notes or the course notes or anything else, and of course work together in this small group to complete the problems. And as well, the instructor and however many TAs we could get would be there and walking around to the groups and helping. So we would walk around and insert ourselves into the conversations. If they were getting it right, we would tell them, yes, that's right. If they were getting it wrong, we would say, maybe consider this other approach, and try to get them to get to the right answer. Our goal, and we told the students this, was that everybody leaves the room with perfect, but not because we gave them the answer, because they actually got to the answer working as a team. The small group would submit one page just written down and with all of their names on it, and then we would grade those and then photocopy them a few times and hand them back. So it was a little bit of administrative work to get those grades back to the students, and we would also post solutions to the tutorials promptly after the tutorial ended. And the types of problems that we would ask in these collaborative assignments is really important. We wanted to make sure that they focused on the concepts that students struggled with the most. An example of this in Stat 334 is the idea of communication between states and Markov chains. Students often struggle with that idea, and so we designed an activity and an assignment with some questions that would force them to confront those misconceptions and then make sure that they came away out of that tutorial understanding those concepts better. And often we really tried to have it be an active learning focus. So we would have them play games or imagine playing games with cards or dice so that they would be able to kind of have a tangible way to connect with that material. So after the success that we had using them in the small classes, we thought maybe it would work in the large classes as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Dina, who will talk about how we adapted it for a larger class context.
Thank you, Diana. Our large classes are about 500 plus students. So Stats 230, for example, is a required course for all math faculty students. Stats 202 is also a course that is often taken by a lot of the science faculty students. And so those tend to be class sizes of 400 plus. And Stats 333 is a core 300 level stats course that students will more often opt to actually take. And so we can typically end up with 300 plus students enrolled there. So this is quite a transition. And so in thinking about adapting the same type of setup, we had to kind of work a little bit or tweak the process a little bit. The first thing we realized is that it would be really difficult to do pre-assigned groups. Now, this kind of came intuitively, but also came out of practice because in Stats 202 for my one semester, I would actually assign students to groups, and I would go to the classroom a little bit earlier and I would put numbers, group numbers around the room so that they can kind of cluster to the group number that they'd been assigned to. And so this in itself was just occupying a lot of time from myself as well as the students. And so instead, we opted to just encourage students to work collaboratively and to work together. And so oftentimes as instructors, if we're walking around and notice that a student is still working on their own, we would then encourage them to sort of group into the grouping of students that's perhaps sitting next to them or in front of them and so forth. The second thing is that we sort of moved into using CrowdMark. So once the class sizes got quite large, we decided to use CrowdMark to sort of help administratively with the grading as well as the sending back to students with their graded assessments. We opted to just have students actually fill in their student information, so they would all just receive that block blank. And then afterwards, the instructor or the TA on CrowdMark would actually do the assessment assignment to student. We opted for individual submission in such large groups. This is not ideal, but administratively, again, it was necessary because it was just going to be too much of a task to actually upload assessments and group students in assessments and so forth. And so students would each receive their own page. They would then write their student information, and collectively they would solve, and each of them would then fill in their own word or fill in their own working. With the large class sizes, we opted to make these assessments or these learning activities, I should say, less frequent in nature. So they would each individually cover a little bit more content, occurring perhaps every 2 to 3 weeks. And because of that, we were then assigning them slightly more percentage. So each one of those would be 2 to 3% each. Even though this is a much larger class and that each student is submitting individually, we did also work at keeping focus on threshold concepts. So concepts that as instructors, we know students tend to struggle with given the content we're focusing on. The focus was still active learning with games. And so in Stats 333, for example, even though we had a large class size, we often incorporated dice games into the assessments, or we incorporated other sort of imaginative games or creative games that they could sort of run through their head while they were doing the assessment. There is still instructor and TA presence. So depending on how the tutorials were hosted, for Stats 333, when myself and Diana actually ran that course, we were always there for the tutorials. So there was actually 2 instructors as well as 2 TAs that were present, or more even at the time. And the same thing was done for the Stats 230 and the Stats 202. And so there was always active movement going around from the different groups, again, interjecting to encourage them to think about the solution in a slightly different way, to challenge perhaps their thinking towards a particular question, and to continue to encourage them to actually discuss and learn off of one another. After having sort of had this experience, we also saw similar benefits towards to adapting this to the large classes, which Diana is going to speak to in the next slide.
Thanks, Dina. The first major benefit of an activity like this actually fits in beautifully with the theme of this conference. And that's that this kind of activity, a collaborative in-class assignment or an interactive tutorial or whatever you want to call it, it's both a learning exercise and an assessment. And it feels like that. It feels in discussing with fellow students that you're actually learning something. And it also is an assessment. And so it really is both. And I think it's important to explain to the students that that is the purpose of this, that this is not just an assessment and it's not just a learning activity, that it is both. Learning from each other and explaining something to someone else is a really great way to learn something. So that's the primary benefit for it, I think. Because we have them regularly, it does help to provide a regular review of the material for the students. A lot of research shows that repeated frequent testing is more effective at aiding retention than just one midterm and one final. And so this assists with that. And it also gives feedback to the instructors about what students are struggling with and what they're finding most difficult. If you're walking around the room and you see several groups making the same mistake, you can maybe address that in the next class, or maybe add a question like that to the next written assignment or to the next midterm to make sure that that misconception is getting addressed. So it's really, really nice to be able to address those misconceptions in a low stakes way on these assessments, rather than realizing on the final that they don't understand something. One other really nice benefit is that it does create those social connections between students. So especially if it's a big class, sometimes people can feel lost and isolated, and forcing them to work with 1 or 2 other students, again, on a low stakes assessment is really nice and can create that feeling of a connection with your classmates, and also some personal one-on-one time with an instructor or TA who's walking by. Another really nice side benefit of this thing is that there is no concerns about academic integrity whatsoever. These are open book and you're allowed to talk to each other. So there's no way to cheat on these. It's impossible because that's the point, is that you work with each other. And I think it is really nice for students to have some assessments in a course where they're not just allowed, but specifically encouraged to collaborate with each other. And some other assessments, obviously, that must be their own work. Lastly, it is really, really fun. It's so much fun as an instructor to run these, just to walk around and settle debates. Sometimes people will be arguing about something and you'll come over and you'll say what the correct one is, and half the people go, oh, and half the people go, yay! This is very, very exciting and very engaging. And the students really enjoy it as well. After the first time I ran this with the support of the Light Grant, we did a post-course survey, and it was almost 100% response rate to the survey, and 98% of the respondents said that they found the tutorials fun and valuable in learning the course material. And I don't know when you could get 98% of students to agree to anything. So this was a really big success, and it we found that people enjoyed it in the large courses as well. One little story in particular happened when Dina and I were teaching one of these in Stat 333. On the very first one of these tutorials, we had them play a dice game, and we actually bought a bunch of fair six-sided dice and handed them out to each group. They played the game, did some calculations, and then at the end, they would return their papers and the dice. But then, about a week later, this article appeared in Math News, the student publication, a ransom note to die for. One of our students had kidnapped one of our dice from the activity and wrote this article in Math News and about basically saying that they were going to roll the die every day. And then when we catch them, we have to pay a ransom of the total amount of all of the days that they had rolled. And they went on to calculate the expected value of the ransom payment. And that was a calculation using the concepts from this tutorial activity. And we thought that was just great. So we posted on our student discussion board, Piazza, referring students to this article if they hadn't seen it, and making a counter offer that if the student was able to correctly calculate the variance of the ransom that we would pay, then we would buy them a coffee. Well, that was not good enough for this student. They responded with indeed the correct calculation of the variance and saying, how about you give Timbits to the whole class as a treat? And we said, sure, okay, we'll do that. So we did that. We spent a lot of money on dice and Timbits that term, but we did that as a sort of a class treat, got to give everybody a Timbit. And then on the next midterm, we actually put that question. We basically formalized it a little bit and put this question on the midterm, asking students to validate whether the assumptions of this type of random variable would hold, do some calculations, and then also extend it to what if it was an n-sided die instead of a six-sided die. So this one little thing became like a whole course-long journey that all the students went on together, and it became a really fun story of how engaged students were with this material, and it was really nice and fun. All right, so lastly, Dina is going to talk about how we then took this idea of these collaborative in-class assignments and adapted them to an online situation.
Thank you, Diana. So yeah, having seen sort of the benefit on campus and in person with these type of assessments, and given the current environment that we find ourselves where the majority of us are teaching remotely, we felt that it would be a worthwhile exercise to try and adapt these to the remote teaching environment, especially from the perspective of also encouraging sort of the social connection that's taking place. And so our adaptation was basically to try and make use of the synchronous platforms that we had available to us that also include breakout rooms for discussions. So those would include things such as Microsoft Teams, Zoom, or WebEx. Once in the group, we were encouraging one student to sort of act as the host for that particular group. And so they would be working together to sort of go through the different questions that were assigned to them. And they could share one another's concepts onto one of the sharing information platforms that are available within the call. So that would be something such as Jamboard was one method that we used. WebEx has a built-in whiteboard that you can use within the call. And if a student was comfortable and had the technology, they could also share their own tablet and sort of annotate on that. It did require a sort of encouragement or motivation to have students actually come. And so the one downside or the one struggle that we find with this remote environment is requiring the synchronous participation to be somewhat hard. You may want to rethink sort of how you offer these assessments as either being optional in nature, as being potentially some kind of a bonus grade associated with it, or else to allow to submit within a 24-hour period their own working of this particular activity in case they're not actually able to attend sort of the live or the synchronous session. The other thing that we had to sort of think about was the submission requirement, and sort of the easiest that we approach is still to require individual submission. Alternatively, CrowdMark does have a group functionality, and so if you actually create the assessment with allowing groups, then only one person from that breakout session actually needs to upload solutions, and students just need to be reminded to actually associate their other group members to that particular assessment, and that way you would also be able to sort of encourage them to work more collaboratively because they're also going to be graded as a whole group. So we just wanted to summarize our talk with a couple of key takeaways. The assessments can and should be learning opportunities, as Diana has kind of emphasized throughout the talk. From an instructor perspective, yes, they are sort of an assessment tool, but you are discouraged to sort of think of them as an assessment, but rather thinking of them as a way of sort of helping students learn the material better in a different approach to just being in the lecture. They also create a learning community by connecting students students. So I have seen from my experience that I'll often get a handful of students say, thank you for these activities. They've actually allowed me to meet others in my class that I wouldn't have otherwise interacted with. From the instructor perspective, this has been a wonderful sort of way of sort of breaking down those walls that are often built between instructor students. And I have often found that students get a lot more comfortable around me, and so are even more encouraged to come for help outside of class and ask us for more in-depth concepts and discussions. They also just need to be sort of adapted for course size and context. But as we've presented in this particular presentation, that's actually not difficult. It's a wonderful assessment that can be used in both small, medium classes as well as large class sizes. And with a little bit of adaptation, the same benefit can still be extracted from them for both instructor as well as students. This brings us to the end of our talk, and so we'd like to open it up to questions. Thank you.